Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another episode of Never Lost, where we retell the old Scots folk and fairy tales so that they will never be forgotten. But not this week. This week we'll be doing something a little different. I'll be telling an original folk tale that I've written. The reason for this is that a few weeks ago I told an original folk tale in memory of my Shetland Sheepdog, Beck. Since then, I have been inundated with quite literally two requests that I do another original folktale, and specifically that I do another original folktale about Beck, the first Shetland sheepdog. So, today that's exactly what I'm going to do. So sit back as I tell you the further adventures of Beck, the first Shetland sheepdog. This story I call Beck and the Cu Sith. A lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens, Heather Macpherson lived in a croft cottage on the small Shetland island of Faerie. When she was a young bairn, her father Donald would tell her and her two older brothers bedtime stories of the fairies and the brownies, and of the kelpies and the selkies, and all manner of other magical creatures which inhabited Scotland and its many islands. Much later, when Heather grew into a young woman, she learned that brownies were indeed quite real when she befriended one who moved into a bothy on Fair Isle. Brownies are Scottish domestic house fairies who are tied to the property which they choose as their home. They will perform helpful tasks in exchange for the leaving of small offerings like milk, porridge, or, most favourably, whisky. Gwendolen, for such was the Brownie woman's name, helped Heather to train and raise the runt from a litter of sheepdog puppies. Alongside the little dog, who she named Beck, which actually means little in Gaelic, Heather entered and won the annual sheepdog trials on Fair Isle. She proved to her father and brothers that she was as good, if not better, than any man at herding sheep, and she became the first female shepherd in Scotland. Beck, the little fluffy tricolour puppy, who never grew any bigger than a terrier, became the first ever Shetland sheepdog. Not long after this, Heather took over a farm a mile away from her parents' croft, along with her childhood friend and partner, Mary, and the ever-present Beck. As well as a large flock of sheep, they kept chickens and a small herd of big Hieland coos. The two young women and the little dog often went to visit their brownie friend Gwendolen at her bothy on the hill, and sometimes Heather wondered to herself, if brownies were real, then how many more of the old folk tales and bedtime stories were true? About a year after Heather and Mary took over the farm, it was nearly lambing season, and Heather was out on the hills with Beck, bringing home the flock for the birthing. As normal, Beck had the sheep in a tight bunch and was happily trotting along behind them, with very little need to control the flock. All of the sheep on Fair Isle responded to Beck in a way they never did with other dogs, ever since Heather and the little Shetland sheepdog had rescued almost every sheep on the island from a terrible storm which had struck Fair Isle. From that day on, Beck could achieve, with a side eye and a low growl, what even the fastest border collie couldn't do: make the cantankerous creatures behave themselves and just go where they were supposed to go. On this brilliantly sunny afternoon, as he was gambling along at the rear of the flock, Beck smelled something, a strange, musky smell that he had never smelled before. Safe in the knowledge that the sheep would keep doing what he wanted them to do, Beck veered off and followed the scent. The smell was on the heather and the gorse in a trail across the hill. After a short distance, Beck found a depression in the ground which smelled strongly of the odd scent. In fact, it was 5 depressions. One large, three-sided indent in the soft earth, which was as wide as Beck was, and four smaller, rounded indents in front of it. Like everything that Beck found interesting, which included sticks, dead birds, horse poo, and on one occasion a small beached whale, the little fluffy dog felt that Heather would definitely want to see this. So he ran back in front of the sheep, giving them a side eye and a low growl on the way past, which stopped the flock. Then he ran back up the hill a short way to where Heather was walking with her long shepherd's crook in her hand. He ran up to her feet and gave her leg a couple of gentle paws with his front foot, and then trotted a few paces away and looked back to see if she was following. Heather looked at Beck, who had cocked his head to one side and was clearly waiting for her. "Okay, my wee Beag, what have you found now?" As Heather began to follow the little dog, she said, "I'm coming, lad, I'm coming, but this had better not be another pile of poo or a deed seagull." Beck trotted up to the strange impression in the earth and waited for Heather. When she caught up and saw the dents in the ground, she had no idea what it was that the little dog was showing her. The large, vaguely triangular imprint, with four smaller depressions across the two sides of it, looked a lot like a dog's paw print, if a dog's paw print was ever the size of a dinner plate. "Okay, but what is it?" she said, kneeling down and placing her whole hand easily in the inside of the larger indent. Beck walked to a nearby gorse bush and sniffed it briefly before pulling something out of the thorns with his teeth and bringing it back to Heather. It was a tuft of thick, green hair. Heather took the hair out of Beck's mouth and examined it in the afternoon light. She wondered. "It looks a lot like your chest hair, lad, after you fell in that mossy peat bog a few weeks back." The little Shetland Sheepdog gave her a look which somehow conveyed the undeniable impression that he thought she was an idiot. "Well, I don't know," she said. "I've never seen green hair before. But right now, we hate to get the sheep in to lamb." Putting the tuft of hair into the pocket of her dress, she turned around and said, "Come on, lad. Maybe Mary will ken what creature can hae green hair." Once the sheep were safely in their pens, Heather asked Mary, but her old friend had no more clue than she did as to what animal on the island could have green hair. The following weeks were so busy with the sheep giving birth to lambs that Heather forgot all about the green hair and the strange print in the earth. Once the lambs had all been born and the flock was back out on the hills, Heather, Mary and Beck went over to Heather's parents' croft for dinner and to catch up on the local news. Her mother Alice always got all the gossip from the other croft wives, and her father Donald knew every crofter on Fair Isle. After dinner, they all shared a dram in front of the fire. Beck was curled up beside Donald's border collie, Canna, using the larger sheepdog as a sort of hairy pillow for his wee head. Pouring himself another whisky, Donald said to the two young women, "The Campbells on the other side of the island lost another 2 chickens last night. That makes 5 this week. And a lamb went missing for the Gregor flock as weel." Heather looked up, concerned. "You never said." Sipping his whisky, her father replied, "I'm saying now, lass. Farms hae been losing animals for about 4 weeks now, and naebody's sure how. Bill McGregor thinks we may hae wolves on the island, although don't ask me how they could get here. It's no like they could swim fae Orkney." Heather stood up from the chair she had been sitting in. "If there's wolves, then why aren't we watching the flocks at night?" "Because," said Donald, "naebody believes it's wolves, lass." Heather strode towards the door and grabbed her coat. "Well, wolves or no, if there's anything threatening the lambs, I'm watching the flock. Beck, come." Beck was up in an instant and at Heather's heel as she stepped out into the evening twilight. Donald called after her, but she was gone before he finished saying her name. Looking at Mary, who was still sat in a chair and sipping her dram, he said, "Will ye no try to stop her, Mary?" Mary shook her head. "Nae point, Donald. I love her dearly, but your daughter is stubborn as granite and about as easy to sway as the north wind. Besides, she's got Beck with her. She'll be fine." With Beck by her side, Heather watched the sheep and their lambs all night, and as morning approached, she began to feel slightly foolish. Her father was right. There was no way wolves could have gotten to Faerie. But then what could have happened to Bill Gregor's lamb? Farmers on Faerie lost lambs all the time. That wasn't unusual. Lambs were just as stupid as sheep, and astonishingly, had even less survival instinct. They fell off cliffs, they got caught in rivers, they got stuck in peat bogs, but you found them afterwards. They very rarely just vanished. As the sun approached the horizon in the morning, Heather was about ready to admit to herself that she had been wrong, when in the grey dawn a howl echoed across the hills like nothing she had ever heard before. Oh! It was a low howl, and it spoke to something primal deep in her blood, which froze in her veins at the sound. With her shepherd's crook in her hand, she set off at a run towards where the bulk of the flock were on the hill. Beck set off as well, straight for the flock, while Heather headed slightly uphill to get a better view of the sheep and anything that might threaten them. A second howl sounded, and again Heather's blood ran cold when she heard it. Oh! Beck had made it to the flock and was running up and down, looking around for whatever could be making the noise. A third howl split the quiet dawn. Oh! And this time Heather's feet were suddenly frozen to the spot mid-step. Her shepherd's crook fell from her hand as a paralyzing fear spread through her entire body, and she couldn't move a muscle. In the corner of her eye, Heather saw Beck running towards her up the hill, but in front of her, from behind a large rocky outcrop, came a monster straight from her childhood bedtime stories. It was a huge, dog-shaped creature that stood a foot taller than her and had long, shaggy green hair covering its bulky body. Its eyes seemed to glow red in the first rays of sunshine, which were breaking the horizon behind her. As it padded towards her, Heather noticed that its tail was braided in a tight pleat. The beast stopped a few feet in front of Heather and bared its long teeth, letting out a long, low, menacing growl. Even though she was frozen with fear, Heather also noticed that when the giant green dog stopped, it held its front left paw off the ground with all of its weight on its right. The beast snarled again, showing even more of its mouthful of sharp teeth. But a moment later, Beck was beside her. He barked and growled at the huge, shaggy green creature which towered over the little sheepdog. Beck looked at Heather, who still couldn't move, as the beast took another step closer. Barking constantly, Beck put his front feet on Heather's leg and scratched his paws down her. The slight pain of Beck's scratch on the back of her leg instantly broke whatever terror or magic was paralyzing Heather, and suddenly she could move. In a moment, Heather knelt down and grabbed her shepherd's crook from the ground beside her. As she stood, she brought the long stick up with all of her strength and struck the creature across the head with the top of her crook. At the same time, Beck darted forward and nipped the huge dog's front left paw, which it had put forward with its last step. The green devil dog seemed not to notice the blow to its head, but when Beck nipped its paw, it let out a loud yelp, and it turned and ran, bounding up the hill with remarkable speed and almost no sound. Heather caught her breath in deep, ragged gasps. It was several seconds before she realized that Beck had set off at a run after the creature, barking like a tiny, fluffy maniac. Heather cried Beck's name, but moments later she watched the huge dog crest the top of the hill with Beck still barking close at its heels. She forced herself to run after them, but by the time she reached the hill's crest, there was no sign of either the massive green beast or of little Beck. In desperation, Heather picked a direction and ran down the other side of the hill, hoping to catch a glimpse of Beck and call him back. Beck may have done the majority of his herding by giving sheep meaningful side eyes and growling at them until they just did what he wanted them to do, but he was also a sheepdog from a long line of normal herding dogs. The instinct of the chase was quite literally in his blood. As a result, when the huge green dog turned and fled, Beg's legs were already chasing it before a single thought had passed through the small dog's mind. Over the crest of the hill, the two animals raced, then down the other side. When they tore through a small wood, Beck, who was at least 10 times smaller, scrambled along behind, jumping logs which the larger creature didn't even notice. The green dog, which was as big as a bull, used its bulk to shoulder trees aside and easily jumped a wide peat bog on the far side of the wood. Its larger stride meant that the beast was already outdistancing the tiny dog which was chasing it and barking incessantly when Beck came streaking out of the small wood and plunged straight into the peat bog which the faerie dog had jumped. Beck struggled across the bog with his long fluffy coat soaked in sticky peat sludge. He crawled up the other side of the bog, which was thick with mosses and lichens. When he made it out and looked around for the creature, it was nowhere to be seen, and he was covered in peat bog and green mosses and lichens, which, despite his vigorous shaking, were firmly stuck to his coat. Beck couldn't see the huge creature, but he could still smell it. And like any piece of food at home left within his reach, if he could smell it, then he could find it. So, pointy little nose to the ground, he set off, following the trail. He followed the musky smell of the creature across the island and down onto a sandy beach in front of a rocky cliff. The creature's footprints were clear in the soft sand of the tide line, although the waves would wash the beach clean of them within a few hours. Beck followed the tracks in the sand with an occasional sniff of the air just to confirm that he was closing in on the beast. The sand gave way to a rough, rocky piece of shore, scattered with dark rock pools. The scent angled across the rocks towards the base of the cliff, which rose straight up and was the home of numerous nesting seabirds, which cried out as Beck picked his way across the rocks. The scent was far stronger now, and it was mixed with other smells. Bird poo, obviously, but also bone and meat. When he reached the point where the cliff met the rocky shoreline, Beck found an outcrop of large boulders which hid a cave in the cliff face. He went to the mouth of the cave and sniffed. The thing was in there somewhere. As Beck went into the cave, the thought went through his little dog mind that the creature he had chased into this cave was considerably bigger than he was. He never wondered why he chased something during the chase. The chase itself was the reason. It ran, so he chased. And that usually worked, because most animals kept running because they were being chased. However, he had chased a swan once, halfway round the side of a loch, which had been great, right up until the point where the swan had turned round, spread its wings, and made a noise that no overgrown duck should be able to make. Somewhere between a hiss and a screech. Beck's survival instinct had kicked in, and he had turned around and fled. The furious swan had chased him all the way back round the loch, and had only given up when Beck had found Heather and hidden under the hem of her dress. There was a low, menacing growl from the darkness of the cave. Suddenly, silently, limping towards the tiny sheepdog, the huge green-haired creature came out of the depths of the cave. Beck considered growling back, but thought the better of it when the creature lowered its head, which was larger than he was, to his level. Suddenly aware that the beast could probably kill him in one quick bite, Beck rolled onto his side in submission and whined pathetically. The giant green dog creature sniffed Beck with its huge wet nose. It had been smacked on the head with a stick by a young woman, which had made it angry. Then it had been bitten on its wounded front paw by a small dog, which had made it even more angry. But that dog had been black, white, and brown, and had smelled of humans. The tiny thing lying in front of it now was green, and smelled of mosses and peat bog. The beast came to a decision and opened its huge mouth, revealing long, sharp canine teeth. Then it closed its jaws around Beck with a gentleness that would not have seemed possible for such a large creature, and it picked him up by the scruff of his neck. The beast carried Beck into the back of the cave and delicately put him down on the ground. Then it made a soft whine, and 5 little dogs came gambolling and bounding out of the darkness. Their fur was green, like the huge creature, but fluffy, like a puppy. They were tiny compared to their mother, but about the same size as Beck was. The 5 smaller dogs leaped about and over Beck, mouthing his ears and grabbing on to his floofy tail. Beck played with them for a short time until the giant dog lay down and the 5 pups crowded in to feed. While the pups suckled, Beck quietly sneaked back out of the cave and began to make his way back along the beach, heading in the direction of home. He met Heather on the way, and she ran to him and lifted the little dog into the air, saying, "Beck, thank goodness, there you are. I was so worried." Then she held him out and said, "You've been through another peat bog, I see, and you stink, wee man. It's the sheep dip for you when we get back to the farm." But she hugged the little sheepdog close to her chest and rubbed him as best she could on her petticoat before putting him down and calling him back to her heel. As they made their way back to the farmhouse past the cow field, one of their Highland cows, Agnes, watched them pass by the field as she lazily re-chewed a mouthful of grass. At the cottage, after washing Beck thoroughly in the sheep dip, Heather told Mary all about her frightening morning, while Beck rubbed himself dry against every piece of upholstered furniture in the cottage before curling up in front of the fireplace. Mary never questioned Heather's amazing tale about the giant dog with green fur and a braided tail. Consoling her partner, she said, "That's awful, my bonny Heather. Thank goodness you had Beck with you." Heather nodded. "Right you are, Mary doll." Then she looked at Beck and said, "Although I could have done without him chasing the muckle thing when it ran off. Isn't that right, my wee Beck?" Mary looked thoughtful for a moment and then said, "I wonder where it went, and what's to be done now that we ken it's aboot. I mean, we canna hae a monster like that preying on the lambs all season. Maybe Gwendolen can help." Heather slapped her forehead with one hand and exclaimed, "Of course! I'd near forgotten our little bothy brownie friend. We can walk up to hers this evening, take her a dram and ask her advice. She is a faerie after all. Well, sort of. She probably kens better than us what we can do to rid the island o' that big beastie." That evening, Heather, Mary, and Beck walked the short distance up a nearby hill to the old bothy that the brownie Gwendolen had made her home. As usual, Gwen was sitting in a small rocking chair that Mary had made her in front of her fireplace, which always burned with a mystic faerie fire which gave off no smoke. She was crocheting something that might become a blanket with the wool which Heather and Mary gave her an ample supply of. Her hair hung down either side of her face in thin white wisps, and her wrinkles made her look like a tiny old woman, although nobody actually knew how long brownies and fairies lived. Gwendolen greeted her friends and bid them come in without rising from her little rocking chair. She reached into a pocket and tossed a strip of dried meat in front of the fireplace for Beck, which he eagerly devoured. The 2 young women and the little brownie settled down and shared a few whiskies, while Heather told Gwendolen everything about her meeting with the huge green-haired dog, up until it had fled with Beck in pursuit. The brownie woman listened intently, as she always did, sipping her dram and occasionally puffing on her foul-smelling pipe which she held in her mouth. When Heather had finished, Gwendolen took a few more puffs of her pipe and said, "So, wee Beck chased off a Cu Sith, did he? He's either even braver or even dumber than I thought." Heather and Mary both sat forward and said, "You ken what the creature was then, Gwen?" "Och aye," the brownie replied. "Muckle big green-haired dog the size of a bull, wi' a braided tail, nae doubt aboot it. That's a Cu Sith, to be sure. One o' the faerie hounds of the Downie Sheepdog, the tall elven fairies who dwell in the fae realm." "What do you ken about them, Gwen?" asked Mary. The brownie puffed on her pipe again. "Weel," she said, "ye ken the Downie Sheepdog, the tall elf fairies, who be the direct descendants of the old gods. They have fairy dogs, just like humans have dogs, only their dogs are the Cu Sith, huge, fearsome beasts with green, shaggy hair. Cu Sith are near perfect hunters. They can move without a sound despite their size, and they can run as fast as a horse. The Downie Sheepdog send them into the real world, hunting for animals and men and women. Some say they drag nursing mothers back to the fae realm, where the poor women are forced to feed and raise fairy babes. They silently stalk prey until they're ready to paralyse them with the terror howl. That's what froze ye in place, Heather lass, and stopped ye moving, till wee Beck broke the fear spell." The brownie puffed her pipe again and took a sip of her whisky. "The howl is a strange thing, to be sure, and I dinna understand the hows or the whys o' it. Maybe it calls back to a time when men and women roamed the wilds and were hunted by dire wolves and fairy dogs regular. But it works by frightening someone so much that they can't so much as move a muscle. There's always three howls. The first lets ye ken that the Cu Sith is stalking ye, and lets the beast smell your fear. The second is your chance to run as fast as ye can for shelter, for the Cu Sith will nae go into a place that has 4 stone walls. If ye dinna reach shelter, then the third howl will freeze ye in terror, and the beast can take ye or kill ye as it pleases." Mary put a hand over her mouth and gasped, "My God, what frighteningly evil creatures!" Gwendolen puffed on her pipe and said, "Frightening, to be sure, lass, but not so much evil. A Cu Sith is a muckle, terrifying, fearsome dog, to be sure, but it's still just a dog. They do what the Downie Sheepdog train 'em to do, that's all. It's odd, though, for one to hang about for weeks. Usually they catch what they were sent to catch and then take it back to the fae realm." Heather was thoughtful. "But how, though, Gwen? And how did the Cu Sith get here in the first place?" The brownie waved a hand dismissively. "Och, that's easy, lass. It'll have come through the stone circle on the east side of Fair Isle. Every stone circle is connected to the fae realm in some way. A better question is, why hasn't it gone back?" Later that night, back at the farm cottage, the brownie's words kept coming back into Heather's mind. A muckle, fearsome dog, but still just a dog. The next morning, Heather and Beck called in at her parents' croft to tell them about the Cu Sith. Both of her parents had heard stories of Cu Sith, but they'd never met anybody who had actually seen one. Heather's mother, Alice, was worried and made Heather promise not to watch the sheep at night until something was done about the creature. Her father, Donald, told her that he would talk to the other farmers and crofters in the next few days and let her know what they all decided. On her way out, Alice gave Heather a basket full of 6 haggis that she had made the day before. Heather accepted the basket gratefully. Mary was very fond of Alice's haggis, which was famous on Fair Isle. Heather herself had never been overly keen on the Scottish dish, She felt that it consisted of all the bits of a sheep that she really didn't want to eat, no matter how good they were made to taste. Haggis, for anyone listening who has never had the pleasure of trying it, is a delicious Scottish national dish. It consists of sheep's lungs, heart, and liver chopped up and then mixed with oatmeal, pepper, and suet, which is the hard fat from around the kidneys. The foul mixture is then stuffed inside a sheep's stomach lining and boiled. Haggis was a vital foodstuff in times when crofters had to use every bit of the sheep. Nowadays, it's mostly used to see if foreign tourists are willing to eat it once they know what it is. As Heather made her way back towards the cottage that she shared with Mary, Beck padded along by her side. Occasionally, he would paw at the back of her leg as if he wanted something. Heather assumed it was the haggis. But when they were about halfway home, Beck pawed her again and then trotted off to one side and looked back at her. He often did this when he wanted her to follow him. "What do you smell, Beck?" Heather asked the little dog. "We've no time, wee man. We have to get back." But Beck just went a few steps further and again looked back at Heather. She relented, saying, "Okay, fine. Where are we off to now?" She had learned to trust the little sheepdog, who had often heard or smelled a sheep in trouble and led her to it in the past. Beck led Heather over the nearby hill and through a small wood, then across a peat moor and to the top of the cliffs on the east side of the island. He trotted along the tops of the cliffs, with Heather following, until he reached a spot where he could get down to the sandy beach of the shoreline. Along the beach they went, and soon reached a rough, rocky part of the shore. Beck angled straight across the rocks to the mouth of a cave that was hidden from view. "Okay," said Heather, looking into the darkness of the cave. "Why are we here? Is there a sheep in there?" She took a few steps towards the cave, but stopped in her tracks and froze when she heard a low, menacing growl come from inside. She tried not to make a sound, but Beck, who was entirely unconcerned, barked a few times beside her. As Heather peered into the cave, the darkness seemed to coalesce into a dark green form which padded silently into the half-lit mouth of the cave. Beck gave a few more barks, but these weren't alarm barks or warning barks. They sounded more like greetings. The brownie Gwendolyn's words came back to Heather. A muckle, fearsome dog, but still just a dog. So Heather stooped down and made herself seem smaller. She kept her gaze to the ground, avoiding eye contact with the Cu Sith. Then she slowly and calmly took one of the haggis from the basket and put it on the ground in front of her and took a step back. The Cu Sith came forward and sniffed the repulsive, awful stuffed sheep's stomach. Heather noticed that the huge green dog was still favouring one front foot, holding its weight off the other. The Cu Sith lowered its head and took a small bite of the haggis, which, given the size of its head, was still half of it. While it ate the other half, Heather emptied the rest of the basket of haggises in front of the Cu Sith. Before eating any more, the Cu Sith picked one up in its huge mouth and put it just inside the mouth of the cave and whined into the darkness. Moments later, the Cu Sith puppies came gambling out of the murky cave to investigate the haggis. After a few failed attempts at playing with the awful pudding, one of the pups broke into the haggis and they all began to eat as well. Meanwhile, Beck had dragged one of the haggis away from the terrifying Cu Sith and himself began eating it. When the 7-foot-tall faerie monster moved to take the haggis back off the tiny sheepdog, he side-eyed it and growled under his breath. Heather smiled as the Cu Sith backed away from Beck, looking slightly embarrassed. The Cu Sith padded back to the cave, favouring one of its front legs, and it lay down to watch its puppies attack the haggis. When they had finished, the pups turned their attention to Beck, clambering over him and trying to catch his tail. They also investigated Heather, sniffing her and chewing her dress. One was slowly dragging her shepherd's crook into the cave, getting teeth marks all over it. Heather cautiously approached the mother Cu Sith, who was still lying in the cave mouth. She reached out and gently took its front paw and confirmed what she had thought. It was injured. The Cu Sith had stepped on an iron nail, probably from a fence or a cart. The nail had gone straight through the animal's foot, and the sharp end was sticking up out of the top of its paw. Now, suddenly, the Cu Sith wasn't a muckle, fearsome dog, or even just a dog. It was an injured animal that Heather could help. First, watching the Cu Sith's head the whole time, she gently took the nail out of its paw. Then she washed the wound with whiskey before tearing strips off of her dress to bind the wound. When she was done, the huge dog gave a low, murmuring whine and retreated into the cave, followed by its pups. Heather came back with Beck every day for the next 3 days to check the faerie dog's wound and to bring it and its puppies food and fresh water. By the 3rd day, the Cu Sith would be waiting for her at the cave mouth, actually wagging its long braided tail in anticipation. And it was happy to let Heather scratch behind its ears while she watched Beck being mobbed by the puppies. Heather told Gwendolen all about it one evening at the bothy with Mary, and the brownie remarked, "It will have been the iron nail that kept it here, to be sure. Nothing iron can pass into the realm of the Downie Sheep. The elven fairies cannae abide iron. They calls it the blood metal. The poor creature'll probably go back when its wound is healed." "Good," said Mary. "I ken you've made friends wi' it, Heather, but I still don't like the idea of a fearsome fairy dog on the island." "It's really quite nice once you get to know it. Beck seems to like it well enough," said Heather. "That's as may be," replied her friend. "But it makes the farmers and the crofters nervous." Heather looked uneasy. "You're not wrong there, Mary. I hope they're not going to do something monumentally stupid." The following evening, while at her parents' cottage for dinner, Heather learned that the islanders were indeed going to do something about the Cu Sith. Heather and Mary were sharing a whisky with Donald and Alice after dinner when Donald said to her, "Mind you and Mary stay indoors tonight, lass. The hills will be crawling with men hunting for this faerie hound." Heather nearly spat her whisky across the room. "What do you mean hunting, Da?" Donald looked surprised as he explained, "Did I no tell you the other day, lass? A great posse o' farmers are going out to find and kill the beast tonight, before it takes any more sheep or lambs." Heather stood up, protesting, "You can't, Da, 'tis just an animal." Her father looked confused now. "Aye, lass, but it's a bloody muckle fearsome animal. We can't have its like running about the island." Heather was insistent, saying, "We have to do something, Da." But Donald was resigned. "There's naught we can do, lass. There's 30 men going out later to hunt it. You cannae stop them." Heather was already on her way out the door. "You see if we can't. Come on, Beck." Beck was at her heels in a moment, and she was out the door, closing it dramatically behind her. The effect was only slightly spoiled when she had to come back a few seconds later because she'd forgotten Mary, whose help she might need if she was to pull this off. On the way back to their farmhouse, Heather explained to her friend what she was going to do, and what she needed Mary to do. "Are ye sure, my bonny Heather?" said Mary. "If it works, the men are going to be mighty angry when they realise, and probably be all the more determined to hunt the Cu Sith." "I ken that," said Heather, "but hopefully it will be safe back in the fairy realm by then." Mary smiled at her partner. "Okay, my bonny Heather, you get the fearsome fairy dog, I'll get Agnes and the girls." A while later, when the moon was high in the night sky, casting its silver light over the hills of Fair Isle, 30 farmers crudely armed with torches, pitchforks, scythes, and various other farm tools, were stalking across the hills when they caught sight of the fearsome Cu Sith lumbering up a slope. They immediately gave chase with the false confidence that comes from mob mentality. When the posse reached the crest of the slope, they saw the beast again, this time far along the ridge, and again they ran towards it, waving their weapons and torches in the air and shouting. Then they saw it again, going up the next slope. Then, somehow, the beast slipped behind them, and they had to troop back on themselves. By this point, the mob had split into 3 separate, smaller mobs, each chasing the Cu Sith at their own pace. The hills echoed with shouts of, "There it goes!" and "It's over there!" Soon, the fastest and most persistent mob had cornered the faerie creature in a wee glen with rocky slopes on either side. The fact that they could still hear shouts of other mobs around them crying, "We've got it now!" and "That way, lads!" was of little concern. The Cu Sith had gone in that wee valley, and it surely couldn't climb out. So the men spread out in a sparse line and went in after it. They caught sight of the Cu Sith at the dead end of the glen, and 3 men stepped forward with pitchforks levelled and torches raised. There was a rustle from behind a large copse of trees and bushes. The lead man called out, "We have ye now, beastie! Your days of pinching lambs are done." He stepped forward, holding his torch up, and said, "The farmers of faerie are more than a match for a foolish Cu." One of the men behind him spoke up, correcting him. "You mean Cu Sith, Gregor?" The lead man turned around and looked back. "Nay, Finlay, 'tis just a Hieland Cu. A big, green Hieland Cu." He moved closer to the beast to illuminate it with his torch. "Look, it's got horns and everything." A similar scenario was playing out with each of the mobs as they cornered one of the decoy Cu Sith, which were really just Highland cows that Mary had dyed green in the farm's sheep dip and then let loose on the hillside. Meanwhile, Heather and Beck had gone to the real Cu Sith's cave. Heather had coaxed the creature out with haggis and began leading it across the island to the stone circle, which Gwendolen the Brownie had said was the doorway to the faerie realm. The pups followed behind their mother, but they were also constantly wandering off, and Beck was having to herd them back to Heather and the Cu Sith. The Cu Sith seemed to understand the sense of urgency which Heather was projecting as they moved over the hills and small moors of Faerie. Beck came behind them, zigzagging back and forth, keeping the pups from getting separated. Despite the urgency and the best efforts of Beck, they made slow progress across the island. The Cu Sith could carry 1 pup, and Heather could manage 2, but there was no way they could carry all of them. Heather felt an immense sense of relief when the stone circle came into view on top of the next hill. But a moment later, from not far enough behind, they all heard the shouts of the mob, and looking back, they saw the orange glow of the torches. They set off at an even faster pace, with Beck driving the pups forward as quickly as Heather and the Cu Sith could go. But the huge faerie dog was still slowed by its wounded paw. As they got to the base of the hill and began to climb the final slope towards the stone circle, it was clear that the mob would catch up before they reached the top. But they pushed on until the mob was just a few hundred paces behind. Then, suddenly, the Cu Sith stopped, and it turned and looked at Heather with its amber eyes, and somehow she knew exactly what it was about to do. She grabbed folds of her dress in her hands and held them against her ears as the Cu Sith threw back its head and howled long and loud. "Oh!" When it howled for a second time, Beck joined in as well. "Oh!" And the third howl was chorused by all of the pups. "Oh!" As soon as the third howl echoed across the hills, the mob of men chasing them stopped moving as though they had been frozen in place. The Cu Sith nudged Heather with its head to tell her it was safe, and they continued up the slope. At the top, 9 stones stood as tall as a man in a rough circle. The Cu Sith stopped outside the circle, and Beck herded the pups past it between the stones. As soon as the pups crossed the circle, there was a flash of moonlight, and they were gone. The Cu Sith turned and nuzzled Heather, which almost lifted her off her feet. Then it lowered its head and licked Beck, which left him soaked from head to tail. With a final look back, the fairy dog crossed the threshold into the circle and vanished in a flash of moonlight, leaving Heather and Beck alone at the top of the hill. Flushed with success, Heather rubbed Beck's head affectionately, then immediately regretted it because he was still damp with slobber from the Cu Sith. "Come on, boy," she said. "We'd better get out of here before that mob recover and make it up here." A few days later, when Heather, Mary, and Beck were at Donald and Alice's cottage for dinner, her father looked at the 2 young women meaningfully across the table. "I ken what you both did," he said. Heather put on her most innocent face and said, "We do a great deal. Da, what do you mean?" Donald raised his eyebrows and added, "The coups, Heather." "Oh, aye," she said. "A few of our coups did get out the other night, somehow." Donald tried unsuccessfully to look stern and said, "They got out somehow and dyed themselves green in your sheep dip." Looking slightly guilty, Mary said, "Cows are weird animals, to be sure, Donald. Who can say why they do what they do?" Said Donald sceptically. "And I take it the fairy dog is gone now?" Heather and Mary shared a look and glanced at Beck before his daughter answered, "I don't think it'll be back, Da." Donald smiled at her. "You're a constant amazement to me, Heather." "Well, Da," she said, smiling back, "you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, or a cow by its colour." And that is the end of the further adventures of Beck, the first Shetland Sheepdog. Beck and the Cu Sith. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please leave a comment or a like down below. Thank you all for joining me. And I very much hope to see you next story.